And with this mission today, we are having this particular session in our row of conducting every 6 days a week live interactive session. Today, we have taken current affairs and a very, very important topic for this year's class: environment and ecology, important development around this particular area. Over to you, Avinash, sir.
Yeah, okay. So, hello.
We are getting your voice, sir.
One second. Yeah, hi guys. So the chat is active if you guys want to ask any questions. So, like in today's video also, we are going to focus on certain conceptual topics where I think that you can have a paragraph based question. Now, I'm not going to obviously if you would have noticed by now that in our videos we don't talk about the fairly obvious things, right? So for example, today we'll not probably not be talking about, let's say, the Delhi pollution, because the thing is, as I told you, you should by now be very, very aware of these obvious things, right? And what I want to do today is I want to talk about certain topics that I feel are fairly, in the sense that paragraph oriented, right? Because any topic that I'm going to discuss today will have certain facts. It will also have certain concepts which I think are an important part of your understanding of environment and ecology. So having said that, let's try to cover as much as possible given the time that we have. Okay. So let's start with environment and ecology today. So the first thing that I want to discuss is sustainable development, and obviously we are not going to be discussing climate change here because we've done one proper 40-45 minutes lecture on climate change. So for videos on climate change, you can refer to the YouTube channel Philosophico, and our climate change video is there anyways. So today the first topic that I want to discuss with you guys is on sustainable development. Okay. Now, under sustainable development, something very interesting has happened in the recent years, and especially now, there was a very important current affairs news that might have skipped your, let's say, notice, so as to speak. So, the first topic that I want to discuss is biofuels. Okay. So, recently, one second. Okay, anyways, right? So recently what we figured out that Indian Airport operates a fleet of AN-32 transport aircraft, and recently what DRDO did was DRDO said and gave a proper certification that the AN-32 aircraft carriers that we sorry not aircraft the air transport carriers that we are flying, they can now fly with a 10% biojet blended ATF or an aviation turbine fuel, and this 10% blend which is to be mixed with this aviation turbine fuel will be made of Jatropha oil, and India is the first developing country which is experimenting with biojet fuels. Now the thing is, we all know that India has almost everything, but India doesn't have oil. So most of our oil is met through imports, and that has a very large, let's say, sort of a economic impact on us, right? Because we have to pay foreign countries for oil, so a lot of money from India generally goes out for these payments to these oil producing countries. So what India is looking at is, obviously we are looking at, so we have immense hydroelectric potential, so we want to have electric vehicles. Similarly, there are certain vehicles and certain, for example, I think it's very hard for us with the current technology that we have to have aircrafts flying on solar energy or electricity, right? So that's not going to be possible. So in the short run, what we are aiming to do is we are aiming to blend certain biofuels with the regular fossil fuels that these aircrafts are using to fly. Now, with a reduction, so let's say even if we use 10% of blended biofuel for our aviation turbine fuel, that will reduce pollution. Then it will also lead to a lot of savings in terms of import bills for fuel that we have to incur as a country, right? So there has been a specific plant in the news known as the Jatropha plant. Okay, so Jatropha is a plant of Latin American origin. It comes from South America. Now, in its characteristics, it's a drought resistant perennial plant which lives up to 75 years. So for example, in India we can produce Jatropha plants in areas where as it is, a lot of crops are not being produced. So there are a lot of arid areas in India where you obviously can't grow rice, where you obviously can't grow a lot of food crops. So what Indian government could do is that it can encourage farmers in that particular area to grow crops like Jatropha. So A, it will reduce our import bill. B, it will also give the farmers, or let's say, a form of income, and that will help us in realizing the target of doubling farmers' income by 2022. Okay. Now, so this plant, Jatropha plant, it has seeds which contain about 35% non-edible oil, and this can be directly used in diesel engines to mix with the fuel, and it acts as an extender or a biodiesel fuel. So let's say if your car uses, let's say, 10 liters of fuel every year, every day, then you can, with this mixing, now be using 9 liters of diesel and 1 liters of Jatropha oil. So therefore it will be able to meet these two targets. Now another benefit of Jatropha is, after extracting the oil, the seed cakes that are left, they can make for an excellent organic fertilizer, and they have a very high nitrogen content, right? And it can also be used as insecticide and fungicide. So now this will be very, very natural. So instead of putting chemical sprays in your fields for killing insects and fungus, you can use the Jatropha seed cakes, and you can also use them as fertilizer. So you don't have to spend money on artificial and chemical fertilizers. That will reduce pollution, and it will also reduce the sort of money that the government has to spend vis-a-vis manufacturing these fertilizers and regulating these fertilizers, etc. So this is what was there in the news. However, another thing that I want to discuss is the categorization of biofuels, because I believe this is very important, and we need to understand what are biofuels and what sort of biofuels are we using now, what sorts of biofuels do we envisage to use in future. Okay, so let's talk about what first generation biofuels are. Now, first generation biofuels are very simple. They use food crops like wheat and sugar for making ethanol and oil seeds, that are edible oil seeds, that can be used for biodiesel by a method of normal fermentation. Now, the issue with using first generation biofuels is, obviously in India, we are a stressed country in the sense that we anyways have food shortages, etc. Right? So we would not want to use land which is being used to produce wheat and sugar and then divert that land to produce biofuels, because then that defeats the purpose already as it is. So the first generation biofuels was an experiment, and now we have entered into the era of second generation biofuels. Now the benefit of second generation biofuels is that they use non-food crops and feedstocks. For example, you have Jatropha, wood, grass, seed crops, and a lot of organic waste. So these non-food crops can be grown on land which is not suitable for growing food crops. So your pressure on and let's say, so the pressure on land resource utilization is also not affected that much, and you can use semi-barren land, which is as it is in abundance in our country. Okay, then you have third generation biofuels. Now these third generation biofuels are obviously costly to manufacture, and therefore these are not economically viable as of now. But obviously the plan is to make sure that with economies of scale being realized, we are able to reach some form of third generation biofuel manufacturing. So they are made by using specially engineered algae whose biomass is then converted into biofuel. So for the thing with algae is that they will use even lesser land, and they will use even more degraded kind of land. So you can have these specially engineered algae in growing in proper wasteland. So it does not put a lot of pressure on the agricultural land. Then after your third generation biofuels, obviously the final generation biofuels that we are talking about, and this is completely in the planning stage, is the fourth generation biofuel. So the idea behind fourth generation biofuel is to produce sustainable energy, obviously, but the fourth generation biofuel should also be a way of capturing and storing carbon dioxide. So the primary culprit behind climate change that we are seeing is the excessive amount of carbon dioxide that is being released into the Earth's atmosphere vis-a-vis developmental activities and consumption activities of humans, right? So these activities are known as anthropogenic activities, which are created by humans. Now the idea of fourth generation biofuels is to make sure to capture certain forms of CO2 and store them within these biofuels, or store them in the soils itself. So this technique of collecting carbon dioxide is known as carbon sequestration. So this is a term that I forgot to mention here, but you should be aware of this term known as carbon sequestration. Okay. So if you have any, so I might be throwing a few terms in this lecture. So if you have any doubts, the chat is open. You can ask your questions there. Okay. Now, there is one very important scheme that is being propagated by the central government in line with the policy of using and promoting biofuels. That is the Pradhan Mantri Jeevan Yojana. So Jeevan stands for Jaiv Indhan Vatavaran Anukul Fasal Avshesh Nirvan. Okay. So under the Pradhan Mantri Jeevan Mission, the financial support is going to be provided to bioethanol projects. So there is a form of funding known as the viability. One second, why is this? Yeah. So there is a form of funding known as the viability gap funding. So what happens in viability gap funding is it's a concept of developmental economics. So basically, obviously, there are certain projects wherein private sector would not want to invest because they are not going to get the adequate returns for the company or an enterprise to be a profitable enterprise, right? So the government comes up with this idea of viable gap funding. You can see viable gap funding in the Udan scheme that the central government has come with, wherein air connectivity is being promoted through smaller airports. And if, let's say, if so, the idea is to reduce ticket prices, but obviously reduce ticket prices would not appeal to the aviation sector because they would not be able to give them enough profit. So the government gives them some money in the sense that if the government says that you need 5,000 rupees per ticket to be the cost to run this enterprise profitably, but the government says that but however, we want more and more people to travel, so they cap the prices at 3,500 rupees, but then they will provide those 1,500 rupees per ticket to this enterprise. So this model of funding is known as the viability gap funding. And because biofuels as of now are not a very productive enterprise, under the Pradhan Mantri Jeevan Yojana, Government of India will give viability gap funding to have integrated bioethanol projects, and the timeline is from 2019 to 2024. So for a good 5 years, Government of India will provide viability gap funding so economies of scale can be built up. And the plan is that by 2025, the market for biofuels will be enough for the enterprises to come in and profitably enter into the manufacturing of biofuels. Okay. Now the second topic in your sustainable development is something that I really want to talk about. This is energy efficiency. Okay. Now the thing is that we can't do away with the fact that we need energy, and with the sort of development that India is seeing, our energy demand is going to continue to grow. So we can't reduce the energy demand. What we can do is we can look at the sort of energy efficiency that we are targeting. So let's say India has equipment that are consuming 100 units of electricity. Now, obviously, if going by the same pattern, let's say population expands, businesses expand, development expands. So the present forecast would be that in 10 years' time, we will need 200 units of energy. If now we obviously cannot reduce that demand because that would be counterproductive. What we can do is we can increase the energy efficiency of the products, and we can reduce the transmission and transportation losses of energy, right? So let's say we have some form of an inbuilt mechanism to promote energy efficiency. Then instead of using 200 units 10 years down the line, we can probably restrict it to 180 and 170 units. So that effectively works towards reducing the energy demand by 30 units and not having any sort of economic impact as such. Okay, so the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, which is a statutory body under the Ministry of Power, it has come up with this index known as the State Energy Efficiency Preparedness Index. Okay, so what this index specifically does is that it tracks the progress of energy efficiency initiatives that are taken by state governments and UTs. Now it has a complex set of 97 indicators. I'm not gonna go discuss all these indicators, but as per this index, there are 6 distinct sectors that are being looked at, which are high energy consuming sectors. So you have buildings, you have industry, then you have municipalities, transport, agriculture, and discoms. So discoms are basically distribution companies of energy. Okay, now it categorizes states as front runners, achievers, contenders, and aspirants. Okay, now the issue is that we have built this index, but no state has come up to the category of front runner. So that effectively means that a lot of states do have a lot of, let's say, progress to make in terms of energy efficiency. So top performing states in India currently under the energy efficiency preparedness index are Haryana and Karnataka and Kerala, and they also lie in the achiever category. So none of them have done a good enough job to fall in the front runners category. Okay, now another very interesting thing that has been done, and that is something that we'll talk about in the next slide, is that the states are marked on the fact that whether they have adopted the Energy Conservation Building Code, or ECBC, that came out in 2017. Okay, so And before we talk about that, there's another energy strategy that has been launched by the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, and that is known as Unnati. So Unnati stands for Unlocking National Energy Efficiency Potential. Okay. Now this is a strategy document which basically outlines what India's goals are on climate change and how we can work towards achieving those goals by not reducing the actual energy demand, but increasing the energy efficiency. Right. Um, One second. So the energy efficiency building code is basically now mandatory for approval of any commercial building. So from today, not from today, as in from like the date the notifications came out, if any commercial building now has to be constructed in India, it has to comply with the energy conservation building code that was released in 2017 by Bureau of Energy Efficiency. Now, what it does is that provides some mandatory requirements of energy efficient design. So it says that buildings have to be constructed in such a manner so that energy efficiency can be promoted. There has to be, let's say, provision for natural lighting. There has to be provision for adequate cooling and ventilation so that you don't have to use lights, or you don't have to, let's say, put in or invest as much money in air conditioned cooling. Now, this will obviously target buildings that have a connected load of 100 kilowatt or greater. This is not important knowledge for you. What is important is, now if there is any building that is being constructed for residential purposes, then obviously that for private residential purposes, okay, not hotels, etc., then obviously they will not be covered under the code. Okay. Now, what the Bureau of Energy Efficiency has also done is that it has launched the star rating program for deep freezers and light commercial air conditions. So until now, there were certain categories of equipments that were covered under the star rating program. So if you look at your homes, if you look at your, let's say, TVs, fridges, CFL lamps, etc., you will see energy star rating. So these energy star ratings are an effort by Bureau of Energy Efficiency. Now these star ratings are also applicable for deep freezers and commercial air conditioners. Okay. So 26 appliances are now voluntarily covered, and under this 10 appliances are mandatory, including your refrigerators, ACs, etc. Okay. Then there is there's a index, there's some sort of a resource that was in the news. This is known as the UDIT tool, or the Urja Dakshata Information Tool, which is an initiative which is taken by Bureau of Energy Efficiency in collaboration with the World Resource Institute. Now, the aim of the UDIT tool is to make sure that there is a database on energy efficiency. Okay, so people know what sort of, let's say, targets we have achieved vis-a-vis energy efficiency, and what sort of targets other states have achieved, what sorts of targets other countries have achieved, and we can then have a mutual, let's say, conference, etc. We can adopt best practices, because at the end of the day, climate change is not one country's problem, right? It's a global problem, so we have to fight it. Now, in line with energy efficiency, what the government of India is also doing is that they are promoting this scheme known as the Kusum scheme. Okay. Now, the Kusum scheme is very interested. Under the Kusum scheme, the government of India is going to provide subsidies and technical help to farmers, etc., to, let's say, install solar water pumps in their field. So what currently happens is that you have diesel powered or electricity powered pumps in your fields which are used to dig out the underground water. Now obviously that consumes a lot of energy, and that and what the Kusum scheme now aims to do is to replace these diesel slash electricity pumps with solar electricity pumps, so that the farmers also now don't have to rely on proper supply of electricity by the state. Right, for example, let's say there is a problem in transmission lines, and during peak seasons where farmers have to water their crops, your these things are not your electricity is not there, or let's say diesel prices suddenly go up, so that leads to a loss to the farmers. However, if you look at it in terms of, let's say, longer units of time, solar energy is definitely going to be much cheaper. Okay. Now this ties very well with the plan of the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy to have a decentralized solar capacity of 25,000 megawatts by 2022. So it is in line with all of this that these sort of schemes are being promoted. So all of this falls under the category of energy efficiency. Now I think that there can be a question on energy efficiency, because it is the most important field vis-a-vis climate change, etc., because in the sense that not a lot has to be done, it's only that the efficiency of what is being done has to be increased, and this is the lowest hanging fruit. This is the easiest thing to achieve. Okay. Now, a very interesting thing that happens every year is the Earth Overshoot Day. Now, the Earth Overshoot Day is calculated by World Wildlife Fund and the Global Footprint Network. So the concept of Earth Overshoot Day is that these two organizations get together. They look at the sort of energy consumption, product consumption, consumption of natural resources, etc., which humans consume on an average. And the Earth Overshoot Day effectively marks the day when we have consumed, when we have annually consumed enough that the nature cannot regenerate, right? So let's say, for example, if the Earth Overshoot Day falls on 5th July, that means that by 5th July, humanity has used up as much resources as the earth could have regenerated in the 1 year, and whatever resources we are going to use from 5th July onwards to 31st December are what are basically an excess, and that is something that we have to curb because the earth will never be able to regenerate those resources, and therefore any and every consumption beyond 5th of July is our contribution to destroying our habitat. Now what has happened is in the last 20 years Earth Overshoot Day has moved up by 2 months. Okay, and this year it is the earliest ever. Now it has not been actually calculated because of lockdown, because it works on averages, right? And you never know what sort of, let's say, consumption would happen in the lockdown. But the prediction is that the Earth Overshoot Day this year lies between 29 July to 22nd August. Now anything and everything that humanity consumes beyond this date is basically extra, and that's basically the burden of humanity on the earth. Okay, so this date, Earth Overshoot Day, is very important. The concept is important, and you should know that the World Wildlife Fund and Global Footprint Network are responsible for coming out and calculating the Earth Overshoot Day. Okay. So the next thing that I want to talk about is green bonds. So green bonds have been in the news. It's now, so the green bonds is basically a combination of climate change, environment, ecology, and economics. So therefore, I think green bonds is something that can become an important topic because it covers diverse areas. So green bonds are effective. So in the economy lecture, we were fairly clear about what bonds are. If you're not, you can look at the economy lecture. So effect what SBI, so what SBI has done is that it has listed green bonds worth over $100 million on India's INX Global Securities Market Platform. Now INX Global Securities Market Platform is basically an sort of an exchange that is set up in Gift City, Gujarat. Okay, so what happens in terms of green bonds is, green bonds basically means that the government releases bonds in terms of, let's say, they want money for certain investments. Some private entities raise bonds because they want money for certain investments, and this money is going to be used in certain products, in certain projects which contribute to the fight against climate change. Okay, now what qualifies as green bonds and what are these industries and and activities that qualify as green bonds, for which green bonds can be raised? These are decided by SBI. So they released a green bonds requirement for Indian issuer that was published in 2016, and it is updated annually. Okay. Now this is used to determine what sort of a security instrument can be categorized as a green or a green debt security. Okay. So if you look at the economic survey of 2019 and 22, I suggest that you anyways read the economic survey of 2019-20 because it gives you a great idea vis-a-vis what the country is doing and what sort of steps you're envisaging and what sort of plans do we have for the future, right? So under the Indian Economic Survey, it was reported that India has the second largest green bond market amongst the emerging economies after China. Okay, so for example, if you look at the data for the first half of 2019, India has issued $10.2 billion of green bond, and the first listed green bond in India in INX was one issued by Indian Railways Finance Corporation. So these are things that can come in the form of a paragraph, because I believe that green bonds is a topic that can be covered in a paragraph. There are a lot of information that follows in and around green bonds, and that could very well be a part of the question. Okay. So the next topic that I want to quickly discuss is pollution. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about air pollution in Delhi because I think by now you should have a reasonable idea of what air pollution is, what are the National Ambient Air Quality Index, and what are the level. So what is AQI, etc. I hope that you know that by now, and there is no point in me reiterating that. I'm not saying that there can't be a paragraph-based question on air pollution. There can obviously be a question, but I'm assuming that by now you should have had. I mean, one second. I'm assuming that by now you have a fair idea about this. Okay. Open skies treaty is important, but I think it'll be a very standalone sort of a question, right? Because I don't see that there'll be a paragraph based question on that. But as I said, current affairs, everything is important, but the focus of our lectures is basically in terms of topics that can be covered in terms of paragraphs. So we are not talking about standalone topics. Okay, Ashish, I hope that's clear. So 1 second. So let's talk about pollution. Okay, so the topic that I want to talk, 1 second. Okay, cool. So the topic that I want to talk about here is arsenic pollution in an arsenic contamination in the groundwater. Okay. So there is this organization known as the Central Groundwater Board. Okay. It has released a report titled Groundwater Arsenic Contamination in India. And according to this report, 21 states in India have certain pockets where the arsenic level is above the permitted level. Okay. Now these primarily lie along the Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna river basin are in Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Jharkhand, West Bengal, and Assam, and these are the worst affected states. Okay, now arsenic contamination in the groundwater now has been reported to have penetrated the food chain itself, and that can have a lot of implications. I'll come to that. Now, what arsenic poisoning does is that it causes skin cancer, bladder cancers, kidney and lung diseases, diseases of the blood vessels. Those are known as Blackfoot disease, and it can cause a lot of reproductive disorders. Okay, now regular extraction of groundwater for irrigation deposits. So what happens is if the groundwater is contaminated by arsenic, then what farmers do is a lot of irrigation requirements are met by digging bore wells, etc., and using the groundwater. So now once that groundwater has enough levels of arsenic, that particular arsenic now enters the food crops. Okay, for example, paddy rice farms are flooded with contaminated water because rice needs a layer of water to grow, and if this layer of water is rich in arsenic, then it is obviously taken up by the crops. Okay, now what happens is that we are seeing the process of biomagnification. So let's say one plant of rice, let's say, has 1 unit of arsenic. Okay, now as humans in our so for let's say for one plant of rice, maybe that 1 unit of arsenic pollutant would not be that detrimental, it might not affect the rice. However, we as humans over our lifetime will consume millions of plants of rice, and therefore we will also consume large numbers of those 1 unit of arsenic. And this process wherein the concentration of pollutants keeps on increasing as we rise above in the food chain, this process is known as biomagnification, right? So obviously once arsenic becomes a part of the food chain, then we humans being at the top of the food chain, we are the ones who are going to suffer most from arsenic poisoning because of the concept of biomagnification, right? I hope biomagnification is a little clear to you guys. Okay. Now, the second thing I want to talk about vis-a-vis water pollution is this idea behind water conservation, right? So Niti Aayog recently came out with a very startling revelation. Now, according to the data that was collected by Niti Aayog, 600 million, 60 crore people in India face extreme water stress, and 75% of households in India do not have drinking water on premises. So they basically don't have tap water. They have to go somewhere, they have to use, let's say, community pumps, or they have to collect water from wells or village ponds, etc., right? So we are from a very privileged background in the sense that tap water is something that we take for granted, but 75% of India does not have water on their own premises. They have to go somewhere and fetch that water. Okay, now in terms of rural India, that is even worse. 81% of rural India does not have tap water. Okay, and another interesting bit is that India uses the largest amount of groundwater. However, we are also the third largest exporter of groundwater. So can anyone tell me how India exports groundwater? I want to see if you're following this. It has something to do with agriculture. So can anyone tell me how India exports groundwater? Because obviously we don't send shipments of water, right? So how does India export groundwater? Is there anyone who wants to try? That's okay. So I guess nobody's gonna guess. So let me tell you how. So India is a very large producer of rice, and rice is a very heavily water intensive crop. So it takes a lot of water to produce rice, right? So let's say the top quality basmati rice that requires a lot of water to be produced. What happens is that a lot of that top quality basmati rice is exported to countries like Iran. So what we are effectively doing is that we are exporting rice, but with that rice, we are also exporting large amounts of groundwater, and that is creating a problem. So it's not that we are only using groundwater for our own population. We are also becoming the third largest exporter of groundwater, and that is a big problem. Now, it wouldn't have been a problem if the groundwater scarcity in India would not be such big of an issue. However, as the numbers up and the statistics have pointed out, it's a fairly big issue. For example, 70% of drinking water in India is contaminated. Okay. And out of the irrigation need, 60% of irrigation is done through groundwater. Okay. So there was this another report that came out called the Dynamic Groundwater Resource of India. I don't think this report is important for you, but it helps you understand the context in which we are talking about water conservation. So 90% of groundwater that is used, which is extracted in India, is used for irrigation, and industrial use only accounts for only 10% of groundwater use. So the next time when we try to blame a lot of corporates for, let's say, wasting a lot of groundwater, let's please look at the reality and understand that 90% of groundwater is being used for agriculture. Okay. Now, having these facts in front of you, what the government of India has done is that they have launched the Jan Shakti Abhiyan. So Jan Shakti Abhiyan is basically it's not a scheme as such. It's basically like the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, wherein the government wants us to participate. Okay. So it is obviously a campaign for water conservation and water security, and it is a Abhiyan which is run by multi-ministry participation. It is coordinated by the Department of Drinking Water and Sanitation, which is the newly formed Ministry of Jal Shakti. Okay, so there is no additional funding for Jal Shakti Abhiyan, and any and every construction, for example, recharging liquefiers, ponds, etc., that have to be constructed, that will be done through Manrega, which drives the Jal Shakti Abhiyan in the rural sector. So recently, I think there was a news article which says that the government is also planning to have Manrega for urban sector itself, right? So then Jal Shakti Abhiyan in the urban sector would also then be taken under the Manrega. Okay. So another thing that the government has come up is the Jal Jeevan Mission. So we know that 75 most of the households in India do not have tap water. So the idea of Jal Jeevan Mission is to supply 55 liters of water per day per person, to make sure that all rural households in India by 2024 have a functional household tap connection. So this scheme is also known as the Jal Se Nal scheme. Okay. Now the funding is such that 90% of the money will be given by the government of India for Himalayan and northeastern states. For other states, it will be 50% sharing, and for union territories, obviously, it will be 100%. Now, another very interesting thing that government of India has done vis-a-vis water conservation is to talk about water pricing in India. So what basically happens is that water pricing generally becomes a very heavily political issue. Okay, because for example, in Punjab, there is water scarcity in the sense that there is non-judicious use of water. People are producing rice in Punjab, right? If you look at the video on agriculture, you'd be fairly aware of why growing rice in Punjab is a problem. But the thing is, the incentive for people to grow rice in these countries is basically that in the state is basically that in electricity is so subsidized that the cost of running those bore wells is very, very low, and farmers generally don't care about anything else. They just want that particular rice crop to be grown, and then you have an open-ended procurement regime under the minimum support prices, wherein the procurement for rice is open-ended. So it creates a further incentive for farmers to produce more and more rice. Okay, so the central government, what it has done is that it has given the panchayats and local bodies the power to decide the price of water in India. Okay, so it won't be done through central governments or state governments, which effectively means that the political implication of raising water prices would be far more localized. Okay. Now, there are two things that are important in the news that come with water conservation. The first is the Dublin Principles. Okay, so there was an international conference on water and environment in Dublin, which was held in 1992, which gave out certain principles vis-a-vis conservation, water resource management. Right. So, based on that, Meghalaya is the first Indian state which has approved a draft water policy. None of the other states, as of now, have come up with the draft water policy. But the idea is that the Jal Shakti ministry that has come up, it will encourage states to come up with their own water policy, because water is a resource that has to be judiciously managed. Okay, so Meghalaya is the state that has approved the first water policy, and you should be aware of the Dublin Principles. Okay. Now, another report that Niti Aayog has released is the Composite Water Management Index 2.0. So the first index was released in 2018. Now, it is a collaborative effort of Niti Aayog, Ministry of Jal Shakti, and Ministry of Rural Development. Okay. Now, it started in 2017 to instill cooperative and competitive federalism. So the idea behind cooperative and competitive federalism is that obviously we live in a federal structure wherein the center has certain powers and the state have certain exclusive powers of their own. So within the, let's say, domain of the powers of the state, what Niti Aayog wants to do by having these sort of indices is to make sure that the states can cooperate with each other, in the sense that there is some quantifiable data to calculate what the states are doing right and what the states are doing wrong. So the best practices can be shared amongst the states. So that instills some form of cooperative federalism where the states work towards helping each other. At the same time, there is this idea of competitive federalism, in the sense that states let's say compete with each other and try to outperform each other in certain things. Okay, so let's look at, so the states in the Composite Water Management Index are divided into three categories: Himalayan states, non-Himalayan states, and union territories. Okay, so amongst the non-Himalayan states, Gujarat is the first ranker, followed by Andhra Pradesh. Then in the northeastern and Himalayan states, you have Himachal, which is leading, followed by Uttarakhand. And amongst the UTs, Pondicherry is topping. So in Composite Water Management Index, UTs did not provide any data, and this is the first time that UTs have provided any data, and Pondicherry is leading. Now, the good thing about the Composite Water Management Index is that 80% of the states have shown progress in their water management scores. Now, the issue is that the states which are the most populous states, like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, West Bengal, where the need for, let's say, water management is the max, these are the states that have not been performing well. Okay. So next topic that I want to briefly discuss is soil pollution. So recently Delhi was in news, in the sense that Delhi had started the process for, so for, let's say, bioremediation and biomining for 3 landfills in Bhalsava, Okhla, and Ghazipur. So basically what Delhi government is planning to do is planning to recycle this waste and make sure that the soil doesn't get polluted. Okay, so there are 2 techniques that are being used, and these are important. The first is bioremediation. So that effectively means that you're treating pollutants using some form of biological agents like microorganisms, bacteria, etc. And the second one is biomining, where you're effectively, so what happens in mines is that you separate the ore from the impurities and then you get the proper metal or the mineral that you want to mine, right? So similarly for biomining, you effectively use separator machines, etc., and then you obtain then you separate plastic, wood, and basically biodegradable and non-biodegradable elements, and therefore you're able to recycle it much better, and that leads to much lower soil pollution. Okay. 1 second. So I'm going to skip plastic for now. I don't think we have that much time. So let's talk about biodiversity, because these 3 things have been in the news recently. So cheetahs have been in the news because Government of India plans to import cheetahs from the government of Namibia, and they want to reintroduce cheetahs into India. So cheetahs in India went extinct in the early 20th century, and now the Government of India wants to reintroduce cheetahs into India. Okay, so the plan is to reintroduce them into this wildlife sanctuary known as Kuno Palpur in Madhya Pradesh. Okay. Now this is the location wherein Government of India wants to have the cheetahs. Now initially the idea was to have Asiatic lions as well in this sanctuary, because as of now the only population of Asiatic lions surviving is in the Gir forest in Gujarat, and last year a lot of lions in Gujarat had started dying So the government of India and the forest department and the wildlife department thought that if there is a disease that spreads in the lion population, then it might lead to all of these lions dying out within a period of time, and then we might lose out on the population of Asiatic lions. So the idea was to diversify and spread out these lions all across the country. However, government of Gujarat refused. So vis-a-vis cheetahs, the first plan was to make sure that in Asia we should have Asiatic cheetahs, and Asiatic cheetahs are the cheetahs that are available in Iran. So there are only 50 to 70 Asiatic cheetahs in the wild. So government of Iran has refused to share those cheetahs in India, and therefore we are importing African cheetahs from Namibia. Okay. Then let's talk about the Indian rhino. Now, fun fact, Indian rhino is the largest of the rhino species, and India is home to over 85% of the rhino population in the world. And out of India's 85% of the global rhino population, 90% of the population is concentrated in Kaziranga National Park and a few in Pobitara Wildlife Sanctuary. Both of them are in Assam. Okay. Now, another bird that was in the news was the Great Indian Bustard. So Great Indian Bustard is a bird which is endemic to the Indian subcontinent, that is India and Pakistan. So endemic means basically they are originating from this part and they are only found in this particular part. Okay. So fun fact, before peacock was decided as the national bird of India, some people and a large section of people wanted to name the Great Indian Bustard as the national bird of India. But very simply put, the name was such that it could confuse a lot of people because it rhymes with and it is very close to an expletive. Therefore, this is the particular reason that the Great Indian Bustard was not chosen as the national bird. Okay. Now, vis-a-vis Great Indian Bustard, it is found in Rajasthan and Gujarat, and government of Rajasthan has come up with this project known as Project Godawan for the conservation at National Desert Park in Jaisalmer. Okay, so this is something that is important. Now there are certain topics. Harsh, do we have time to discuss the Indian State of Forest report? Because I think it'll take a little bit of time.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We have that time.
Okay. Cool. So recently the Indian State of Forest report had come out. So Indian State of Forest report is basically a biennial publication, which means that it is published every 2 years. Okay. And it is published by the Forest Survey of India. Now, this is the 16th edition of the Indian State of Forest report. So there are certain definitions that we should be clear about before we look at the data that is conveyed by the State of Forest report. Okay. So the first is vis-a-vis forest cover. So basically forest cover means all land which are greater than 1 hectare, jahan pe the tree canopy density is more than 10%. So it doesn't matter who owns the land. It doesn't matter whether that area is registered or recognized as a forest area. As long as there is a piece of land which is more than 1 hectare in area, and the canopy density or the density of trees in that area which cover that area is more than 10%, that area is classified as forest cover. Okay. Now, recorded forest area is basically that area which is recorded in the Government of India records as a forest area, and this is recorded under the Indian Forest Act of 1927. Okay. So tree cover is basically tree patches which are outside of the recorded forest area, and they are outside of the forest cover. Basically, tree cover refers to areas which are outside of both forest cover and recorded forest area, and they are lesser than 1 hectare. Okay. So let's look at certain important data sets that the State of India Forest report has come up with. Okay. So effectively 24.3. So effectively the total forest area plus tree cover area of India is now 24.56%. Now this is an increase of 0.65% from the last time that this data was collected. So Government of India has, let's say, improved in increasing tree cover and forest cover in India. Okay. Now, obviously, forest cover in the hill districts of the country is higher. It's a 40.3%. And in the northeastern region, the forest cover is 65.05%, which is a decrease of 0.5%. So it's very interesting to note that in the northeast, the forest cover actually has declined as opposed to other parts of the country. Okay. Now, if we look at the largest forest area in terms of largest forest cover in terms of absolute area, then Madhya Pradesh has the largest forest cover, followed by Arunachal, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, and Maharashtra. Now, if you are looking at a percentage of forest cover per state. Then Mizoram is the leader with 85% forest area. Then Arunachal Pradesh with 79.6%, and so on. Okay. So there are certain states which have recorded an increase in forest cover. In those states, the top state is Karnataka, which has seen an increase in about 1,000 square kilometers. Now, certain states have shown a loss in forest cover. And for example, Manipur, which is a very small state, and that has also lost around 500 square kilometers of forest land. Okay. Now, Arunachal Pradesh is a very interesting state because Arunachal Pradesh has very high percentage of forest land, and it also has a large absolute number of, let's say, forest land, absolute area of forest land, and therefore the fact that the forest cover in Arunachal Pradesh is reducing is a big concern. Okay. So so up until now, this is the data that most of the websites that you visit would be giving you about the forest report, but there are certain other important things that have been covered under this particular state of forest report. For example, wetlands are being covered. Okay, so Gujarat has the largest area of wetlands within the registered forest area in the country, and the second is West Bengal. So generally, this is the question that people will get wrong, because people are generally aware of the Sundarbans westland in West Bengal and Bangladesh. So sometimes people might think that West Bengal has the higher, or Odisha might have, because the Bhitarkanika mangroves are there. So people might think that these states have the highest wetlands, but Gujarat has the highest and the largest area of wetlands in the country. Okay. Now, mangrove, that has increased, nothing much. So this forest report has come up with a very interesting data, and it says that about 21%, 21.5% of the forest cover is highly to extremely fire prone. Okay. Now, another thing that this report has talked about is biodiversity. Okay. So other reports had not covered this earlier. What biodiversity effectively means that if biodiversity covers the sort of the number of additional species and the number of the variety of wildlife that and trees that you see all across the country. Okay. Now it says that maximum tree diversity is seen in the Western Ghats, and then you have good amount of tree diversity in the Northeast. Okay. Now, Karnataka has the maximum species richness for trees, Arunachal has the maximum species richness for shrubs, and Jammu Kashmir has the maximum species richness for herbs. So, so basically, if you look at the most variety of trees that are found in any state in India, it's Karnataka. The most variety of shrubs that are found is Arunachal Pradesh, and the most variety of herbs that are found in India is in Jammu and Kashmir. Okay. So there are certain special things that are different about the Indian State of Forest Report 2019, which separates it from the 2017 report. Is that for the first time, extent of trees outside forest has also been derived. So now why this is being derived is because Government of India wants to show on paper that obviously we are doing a good job, and we are increasing the forest cover because we have made some huge commitments in the Paris Climate Accord, and we've said that we would look at carbon sequestration, we would increase the number of, we would increase the sort of carbon sinks, etc. So you have to show on paper that the certain effects. So you have to show on paper that certain things have been done by the government vis-a-vis the commitments that we have given. Okay. Now, there is a first attempt to carry out rapid assessment of biodiversity. So as I talked to you about here, in terms of biodiversity, this has been done for the first time in the Indian State of Forest report. Now, what they've also collected is an information on major invasive species. So invasive species are basically those species of plants that are not from that particular area, but they come into that particular area and they start competing with the natural vegetation of that area. Now that is problematic because the wildlife also in that particular area is going to be affected by the sort of vegetation that you have. And if there are invasive species like, let's say, the lotus, etc., and that comes in, and there are certain invasive tree varieties that come in, then that will also have a bad impact on the sort of wildlife that you find in this area. So for the first time, the State of Forest report has come up with a list of major invasive species. Okay. Now it has also generated information about the top 5 non-timber forest produce, right? So up until now, the Indian State of Forest report used to focus on timber as in wood related forest produce, but it has now generated a list of non-timber forest produce. These are basically forest produce that are used in the forest by tribals, etc., for their everyday survival. Okay. So Ashish says, can I be a little slow? Ashish, I would love to be a little slow, but the issue is that we are a little short on time. So you can watch this video on YouTube and you can reduce the speed if that's possible for you. But I think this is probably the last topic. There's only one more topic that I will discuss. I'm really sorry if I'm going really, really fast. Okay. So the last thing that I want to discuss, 1 second. Okay. So, okay, sorry Ashish for going that fast, but I think I made a large number of slides and I should have kept a number of slides should have been a little fewer. Okay. So now what I want to talk to you about is the addition to Ramsar sites. So let's first look at what Ramsar sites are and what is the Ramsar Convention. Okay. So basically in 1971, a lot of countries gathered together in the city in Iran known as Ramsar. Okay. And then they came up with the Ramsar Accord, which is also known as the Wetland Convention. Okay, this was signed in 1971 and it is the oldest intergovernment record for preserving the ecological character of wetlands. Now, wetlands are very important because wetlands provide a host of ecosystem services. They have rich species diversity. A lot of plants and animals thrive in wetlands. They have high productivity. They filter a lot of water, so they fight pollution. Then they also protect seashores from the effects of cyclones, etc. Right. So wetlands have very high importance, and wetlands also produce a lot of products that human beings generally use for their survival. They give a lot of wood. They give a lot of grazing. They provide a good, let's say, amount of grazing grounds. They also have a lot of good fishing sites, etc. So therefore wetlands are very, very important, and governments all over the world realize this, and therefore they collected in Iran in 1971 and came up with the wetland convention known as the Ramsar Convention. So under the wetland convention or the Ramsar Convention, they came up with this list known as the Ramsar list. So if any country's wetlands are recognized in the Ramsar list, what effectively happens is it gets international acclaim. So let's say, now the thing is, if anything gets international acclaim and then let's say there is some form of destruction or developmental activity in that wetland and that is uh, antithetical to the interest of that wetland, then that gets a lot of international coverage and a lot of press coverage, and therefore it puts an additional pressure for the governments within whose jurisdiction developmental activities detrimental to those Ramsar sites are being carried out. Okay. So up until now, there were 27 Ramsar sites in India, but recently India has added 10 more wetlands to the sites that are protected by this Ramsar Convention. Now, out of them, I think Nandur is the most important because it is Maharashtra's first Ramsar site. Okay, so now there are 37 Ramsar sites in total. There are a few in Punjab that have been added, and there are a few in Uttar Pradesh that have been added. Now I can't explain. It's not productive for me to tell you where all these 37 Ramsar sites are. But what you should do is you should Google and you should try to see where these Ramsar sites are and get a fair idea of where these Ramsar sites are. Okay. Now, within the Ramsar list, so Ramsar list consists of all the important wetlands in a country, okay, that are part of this convention. Now, under the Ramsar list, there is another list known as the Montreux Record. So what happens is that under the Ramsar Convention, there is another subcategorization known as the Montreux Record, wherein what effectively happens is that if in a country, if the Ramsar Convention recognizes that there have been certain activities that have been taking place or changes in ecological character have happened to such an extent that certain wetlands are really, really threatened, then those wetlands are covered in the Montreux Record. And once a wetland is covered in the Montreux Record, then obviously the countries which have those Montreux Record sites have an added pressure to take care of those wetlands. So in India, there are two wetlands that are a part of the Montreux Record. The first is the Keola Deo National Park, which is in Rajasthan, and the second is the Loktak Lake in Manipur. Now, until very recently, the Chilika Lake in Odisha was also placed on the record, but then the government of Odisha put in a lot of effort for restoration and recovery of those wetlands, and then Chilika Lake was removed from this list. Okay. So guys, that's pretty much it. There are a few topics I think that we missed out. For example, plastic waste management rules and e-waste management rules. If we have time next week, we will probably run through a little bit of these. Okay. So I'm really sorry, Ashish and others, if I was really fast, but I think I tried to cover a lot of topics. Okay. So thank you so much for listening. That's it from me, Harsh, today.
Thank you so much,
Okay.
sir.